To listen to American Scandal 1 week early and ad-free, join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app. Download the Wondery app in your Apple or Google Play mobile app store today. It's September 12, 1971, in Attica, New York. Richard X. Clark walks across a massive concrete yard that's covered in mud. He stops, a warm wind blowing through his hair, and stares at the site in front of him. Clark is standing in a prison yard at the Attica Correctional Facility. Normally, this area is under tight supervision, with armed guards standing watch, controlling the movements of every prisoner. But everything changed 3 days ago, when the inmates decided they'd had enough. They were tired of the abuse, of the guards' violence and mistreatment. So the inmates rose up and together they took control of the prison. As Clark looks out over the yard, he still can't believe what he's seeing. Hundreds of inmates move around like free men. A group of hostages sit huddled together on an old mattress with prisoners standing guard. The yard has been turned into a sprawling encampment. It's a democratic society that's run by the prisoners themselves and led by a small group of leaders, including Richard X. Clark. He's only 25 years old. He's slender and wears black framed glasses. Even though he's young, he knows that he and the other inmates have made history. Now that they control Attica, they can demand significant changes, improve the lives of prisoners, but it's even bigger than that. Clark knows they can change prisons across the country, and maybe even the rest of the world. Still, as he looks around the yard, Clark can see that the feelings of triumph and revolution are already fading. It's day 3 of the standoff, and the inmates look exhausted and on the brink of making a rash decision. It's a situation that could only grow worse with some news that has just arrived. Clark approaches an inmate named Frank Smith, a towering man who was appointed head of security. "Frank, we've got a problem." "Yeah, no kidding, we got a problem. It's been 3 days. We're not getting anywhere. We got the prison, but we also got state police surrounding us." "I know. But listen, there's something else you need to see." Clark takes out a message he received from a government official, the man who runs the prisons in New York State. It's from Russell Oswald. It's a demand to surrender. "Richard, he's been saying that from the start." "I know. But Frank, this time, something's different. He's not asking anymore. This is a threat." "Oh, well, let's tell everyone. They gotta know. If our people hear this, they're just gonna dig in their heels. I don't think they need to know that it's come to an ultimatum." "You sure about that?" "I think so. I think it's the only option. If it were the only option, you wouldn't be talking to me right now, trying to figure things out. So here's what I think. When we took over, we made a promise. We make decisions together. All the inmates together. So whatever's on that piece of paper, you gotta read it out loud and let them decide." Clark exhales and shuts his eyes. "Okay." The two men make their way across the yard to a set of scuffed wooden tables. Clark grabs a microphone, wired up to a speaker. At the sound of his voice, hundreds of prisoners suddenly look up. Clark raises the document in the air and announces that he just received a message from Oswald, the head of prisons. The commissioner demands that they end the rebellion and that they release the guards they're holding hostage. Oswald says they need to do so immediately. Then, and only then, will he meet with the inmates to discuss their grievances and possibly changes to the prison. Clark sets down the note and looks at the men in the audience, prisoners who for years have suffered torture at the hands of guards, grievous medical treatment, an unspeakable nightmare day after day, all of which has pushed them to this brink. As Clark looks over the crowd, he asks who's in support of accepting the proposal of letting the hostages go. The yard is silent. Then Clark asks who's against the proposal, and all at once hundreds of men yell out in anger. It's decided. There will be no surrender. Clark swallows hard, because while the men have once again stood up for themselves and their own dignity, Clark suspects that the state is done bargaining. And if that's true, it could be just a matter of hours before they attempt to retake Attica by force. From Wondery, I'm Lindsay Graham, and this is American Scandal. When it comes to prisons, the United States is in a league of its own. Our country has the largest prison population of the entire world. And on top of that, we incarcerate people at a higher rate than any other country. At the same time, many prisoners face inhumane treatment as they live their lives out behind bars. Prison demographics point to enormous racial, political, and socioeconomic divides that have plagued the country since its founding. And while concerns about our criminal justice system have emerged in recent years, this isn't the first time our nation has grappled with the issue. In the early 1970s, the civil rights movement pushed to reform prisons, and many inmates became politically engaged, protesting their brutal treatment. The most explosive of these protests took place at the Attica Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in western New York. Conditions at the prison were appalling, and as tensions came to a head, the inmates decided they'd had enough. They took control of the prison, and for 4 days the inmates captured the nation's attention as they negotiated for a series of reforms. For many, the standoff was a story about the power of hope and courage, but it was also seen as a tragedy of missed opportunities and the devastating consequences of racial animosity. But above all, it was a fight for justice that began in 1971 and still continues today, 50 years later. This is Episode 1, Liberation. It's the summer of 1971. In upstate New York, a gray prison van rumbles down a 2-lane highway. It's a sweltering day, and near the back of the van, Jomo Joka Omawala sits with his wrists and ankles shackled, a bead of sweat trickling down his broad, dark forehead. It lands quietly on the sleeve of his prison jumpsuit. Omawala shakes his head and turns to look out the bulletproof windows. Maybe something outside can distract him from the stifling heat, but all he sees are ramshackle barns and the occasional cow. Omawala can't imagine a duller landscape, but still he is grateful for the view, because soon he'll be back behind bars, and it'll be several years before he sees the outside world again. Omawala is bitter. He won't deny that he committed the robbery, but he feels he did what he had to do in order to feed himself and his family. He was born and raised in the Jim Crow South, and as a black man, he learned that you have to take things if you need them, because you never know what will be taken from you. Because of his crimes, Omawala has been in and out of prison. The guards are often white, racist, and violent. At the last prison, Omawala had had enough. He led a group of men who banded together and demanded better treatment from the guards, but that only prompted additional punishment. Omawala was put in shackles and put into this van, which is taking him to the maximum security prison in Attica. Soon the van pulls into a parking lot and comes to a stop. The back doors swing open and 5 guards step out into the van, holding thick wooden clubs. They stare at the prisoners with cold hatred in their eyes. Then they order the prisoners out of the van. Omawala rises and steps out into the sunlight and gets his first full view of Attica. His breath catches as he gazes at the colossal gray walls of the prison. On top of the walls are gun towers, with guards pacing, hands on their rifles. As he stares up at these towers, suddenly something hard jabs into his lower back. Omawala stumbles forward as guards begin barking, telling him to get in line. Omawala quickly steps up behind the other inmates and begins marching forward. Omawala shudders as he approaches the steel gate of the entrance of the prison. Shadows seem to rise from the ground, threatening to swallow him whole. He's been in and out of plenty of jails and prisons, but Attica has a reputation for brutality, for violence and unbearable suffering. He has no idea what terrors he might face soon, so all he can do now is pray that he'll survive the next few years. Later that summer, in 1971, Jomo Joka Omawala limps down a dark, narrow hallway. He's in a line of 20 other inmates inside the Attica Correctional Facility. Together, they're heading toward the mess hall. Even though his body is racked with pain, Omawala has to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Last night, he went to bed hungry, and it was the same the night before. This morning, his stomach feels like it's about to cave in on itself. He has to get some breakfast, even if every time he takes a step, his muscles ache with pain. When Omawala arrived at Attica just a month ago, he was terrified, but still filled with a sense of righteousness. He believed that prisons had an obligation to treat inmates fairly and humanely, and Omawala believed he had the strength to stand up for what was right. But Attica broke him, and it broke him quickly. He's only been granted 1 shower per week. Each month, he gets a single roll of toilet paper. Jobs at the prison pay just 6 cents a day. He'll need to save up for months if he wants to buy a toothbrush or shampoo. And it's not just that he's filthy or paid slave wages. Omawale has already been beaten by the guards twice. Every day he seems to violate some rule that he was never told about, and the Attica guards begin hitting him again. Omawale feels flat and depressed. He's not sure how much more of this he can take. But for now, he knows he can only focus on the small tasks, taking 1 step forward, getting to the mess hall, getting a plate of warm food. A guard slides open a metal door, and the prisoners continue shuffling into the next hallway. An older prisoner turns back in the line and smiles at Omawale. "Hey, young man, you're new here, right?" "Yeah." "Well, look at you. We gotta get you a shower, maybe some new clothes." "Yeah." "Hey, young man, buck up." Omawale grits his teeth, snarling. "Buck up? Man, I'm filthy, I'm bruised, I'm starving. Can't sleep. This isn't right." "Of course it isn't right. But hang in there. You'll get used to it." "Old-timer, I don't want to get used to it. This isn't how it's supposed to be. They take away your freedom, that's the punishment. Jury and judge, they didn't give me a sentence of no food, no showers, beatings." "I see you haven't lost your fire. I think I heard about you. You came from over in Auburn, right?" "I heard you were in that riot." Omawale grins with a sudden feeling of pride. "Yeah, that was me. But a riot? Nah, that's not the right word. A riot's for people who just want to break things. We want to change things. You took over that prison. That's bold, son. It's not bold if you want basic rights. They wouldn't give it to us, so we tried to take it. And tell me, young man, what happened? We got together, we fought the guards, we took hostages, and the warden tells us, let the hostages go, surrender, and we'll meet with you. We'll consider your demands. It was a trick. There was no meeting. They just beat the hell out of us, and then they sent me here. They tried to break us there, just like they're trying to break us here." Omawale feels an old fire rising up inside him, a burning desire to do something, to change things. But right as he's about to say more, a guard shouts from the front of the line, Omawale and the other prisoner need to stop talking. But the old man shakes his head and shouts back that they're allowed to talk. There's no rule against it. The prison guard stalks towards the old man, his blue eyes cold with fury, and he repeats the order. Omawale and the old man need to shut their mouths. But the older man just says again that inmates are allowed to socialize on their way to breakfast. There's no rule against it. A vein bulges on the guard's neck, and then everything happens very quickly. The guard yanks the older prisoner, begins dragging him away. The old man cries out, his voice echoing down the hallway as the guard announces that he's taking the old man into solitary. And there's plenty of space for anyone else who has something to say. The blood rises in Omawale. The old man didn't do anything wrong. He shouldn't be getting punished. But Omawale knows there's no use getting himself thrown into solitary. That won't change a thing. Instead, what he needs to do is start meeting people and organizing. Because this can't go on. Somehow the inmates have to change Attica. A few days later, Frank Lott takes a seat in the shade in the prison yard at Attica Correctional Facility. He pulls out a notepad and pen and looks up at 4 of his fellow inmates. Then he nods and the men begin to speak in rapid bursts of anger and indignation. Lott writes as fast as he can, jotting down notes about the men's grievances. One inmate described how the guards used him as their personal whipping dog. Another inmate says the prison doesn't offer religious freedom for Muslims. A third man says the parole system is broken. After all the men finish talking, Lott adds to the list with his own complaints. Attica needs to offer real medical care for its inmates. Treatment right now is a joke. It's something that Lott knows all too well. Just weeks ago, he developed a painful rash on his scalp. But when he visited the infirmary, the prison doctor said it was nothing, that Lott should go back to his cell. When Lott insisted he needed care, even just an ointment, he was thrown in solitary confinement. Solitary is a devastating punishment, but that's just how things go in Attica. And that's why he and his fellow inmates are meeting right now. The prison has to change, and the group is drafting a series of complaints and demands. They're calling themselves the Attica Liberation Faction, and they're planning to send their list to Russell Oswald, the head of New York State prison system. They hope that in his position of power, Oswald can do something to change the conditions here at the facility. Lott finishes writing and looks back up at the other inmates. He announces that they now have a list of 28 demands. The message is ready for Oswald. But one of the inmates asks to reread the list. When he finishes, he suggests that they add a note at the end. They should warn that the prisoners may need to take aggressive action if their demands are not met. Lott considers the proposal but shakes his head. He doesn't think they should issue any kind of threat or ultimatum. He's heard good things about Oswald. Lott believes that they have a real shot at getting through, but they have to remain even-tempered and courteous. The inmate pauses, chewing this over. Then he nods, deferring to Lott's judgment. And after checking with the other men, Lott folds up the letter and slips it in his pocket. He tells the others he'll mail it off this afternoon. He's hopeful they can convince someone in power to take action. The other inmates clap Lott on the shoulder, saying they have a good feeling about this. And while Lott offers an encouraging smile, he doesn't mention something that's been gnawing at him. The reason why he didn't want the note at the end, the warning of violence, is because it's all too obvious to him. The situation at Attica has grown truly desperate. Something bad will happen if the letter is ignored. Because every day, tensions are rising inside the prison. Inmates are getting more fed up. They may reach a breaking point. Lott isn't sure exactly what the prisoners might do, but one thing is clear: it won't be peaceful, and it will likely be dangerous. It's September 2nd, 1971, at the Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York. In a dark cell that reeks of mildew, Jomo Joka Omowale holds his head near a small, dented radio. In Attica, each cell has a radio like this one, which only offers 3 stations filled with static. It's hardly a way to pass the time. But tonight, Omowale is glued to the radio, waiting for a broadcast. It could offer details about a new era coming to Attica. Earlier this week, a group of prisoners sent a letter to Russell Oswald, the head of New York's prison system. They called attention to the nightmare conditions inside the prison and demanded reforms. In a surprising turn, Oswald agreed to visit Attica to meet with the prisoners and discuss their proposals. Omowale and the other inmates were stunned to hear the news. It seemed like finally someone might put an end to the beatings, starvation, and reckless use of solitary confinement. Oswald is scheduled to arrive at Attica tomorrow morning, and tonight, starting any minute, there's supposed to be a radio broadcast detailing Oswald's itinerary. As Omowale turns up the volume, there's a crackle, followed by a man's voice, which cuts through the static. He greets the inmates of Attica and introduces himself as Russell Oswald, the head of New York's prisons. Omowale sits up, filled with anticipation, but his heart sinks as Oswald announces that he has some unfortunate news. He planned to address the inmates in person, but circumstances have intervened. Oswald apologizes over the airwaves and says he won't be able to visit the prison after all. But he has read the letter from the Attica Liberation Faction, and he and his staff will seek to make changes if possible. The radio crackles and then goes silent. Omowale stares at the dial, feeling weak with disappointment. Then, somewhere down the hall, an inmate starts banging on his cell door. Omowale rises as the noise grows louder. He looks out at inmates in their cells all around him as they begin to shout in rage, chanting 2 words in a loop: "Cop out, cop out." Omowale clenches his fists in anger. Then he joins the chorus, shouting as loud as he can. These first months at Attica have been a nightmare beyond imagination. They've nearly broken Omowale, and it had seemed like someone in power might do something about it, but his hopes have been dashed, and Omowale is filled with an old, familiar feeling of outrage, the same feeling he had at the last prison before he led an uprising. Omowale had promised himself he'd lie low, get through his time in Attica, but now it's clear that's not an option. He's going to have to fight again, because if the government won't fix Attica's problems, then the inmates will have to do the job themselves. 6 days later, inmate Leroy Dewar squints into the midday sun. Then he quickly dodges right as another man tries to plant his fist in Dewar's face. Dewar skips back, dancing on the hot pavement. Then he dips left as another fist comes flying past his chin. Leroy Dewar is in Attica's yard, grinning as he watches his opponent's maneuvers. While it looks like they're fighting, the two prisoners are actually just sparring, practicing boxing moves. And although this afternoon he hasn't dodged every punch, Dewar can't remember the last time he felt this good. He just got out of a 7-day stint in solitary confinement, a punishment he received for questioning a guard. It was a maddening week spent in near total blackness, and so today, out in the yard, Dewar is soaking up all the sunshine he can get. Dewar and his boxing partner keep swinging, dodging, weaving back and forth, when suddenly there's a shrill whistle in the distance. Dewar knows that sound well. It's a whistle from a prison guard, but he tunes it out, his mind still focused on dodging punches. But the whistle sounds again and gets closer and louder. Finally, Dewar can't ignore it. He raises his hand to stop the sparring and glances over his shoulder. Jogging toward him is a guard whose pale face is red from the sun. Dewar looks around, confused. The guard is Richard Maroney, the senior lieutenant at the prison. Normally, senior guards like Maroney only blow their whistles if there's a serious problem. But looking around, it doesn't seem like there's anything going on. Maroney stops in front of Dewar, his breath labored, orders the inmate to return to his cell. Dewar raises an eyebrow. He's not doing anything wrong. So he asks the guard what's this all about. Maroney steps forward, glaring at Dewar and his sparring partner. He says the fight's over, it's time to get back to their cells. Dewar breathes a sigh of relief. It's a misunderstanding. He explains that he and his friend weren't fighting, they were sparring. But Maroney just shakes his head and says he knows what he saw. Then he sets his hand on his nightstick, tells Dewar to come with him immediately. Dewar can feel his anger rising. He doesn't want to do anything stupid, so he starts to walk away. But that's when he feels the tight grip of Maroney's hand on his shoulder. And before Dewar knows it, his instincts take hold. He spins around and punches the guard right in the chest. Maroney staggers back as Dewar looks at his own fist in shock. He can't believe what he's just done. The guard then lunges forward, seizing his arm. Dewar tenses and waits for a beating. But then he hears the murmur of voices gathering around him. He looks up and sees dozens of other inmates, all walking toward him and Maroney. They form a circle around Dewar and Maroney, and several prisoners start shouting, demanding Maroney leave Dewar alone. Maroney lets go of Dewar, his eyes darting around nervously. The circle grows smaller, and out of nowhere, one of the white inmates shoves Maroney. The guard goes stumbling back. Then, dozens more inmates join the fray, as the circle grows even tighter. These men might have come to his defense, but now Dewar's growing afraid. He can't predict what will happen next, but his gut tells him one thing. If this confrontation escalates, someone could die. Another whistle sounds in the distance, and the inmates turn to a blonde lieutenant named Robert Curtis, racing toward the crowd. He pushes to the center of the circle, demanding to know what's going on. Dewar and Maroney start explaining their side of the story, but the guard waves his arms and tells the prisoners that the show's over. It doesn't matter who did what, everyone just needs to walk away, and that includes Dewar. Dewar stares at the guards in shock. He was sure he was about to get thrown back in solitary confinement, probably beaten, maybe worse. But the guards just walk away, leaving him and the other inmates to themselves. As the crowd disperses, Dewar sits down to collect his thoughts. This never happens. It's almost a miracle. And so there's only one explanation. God must have intervened. Dewar shields his eyes, looking up at the sky, and gives his thanks that this one time he was shown mercy. An hour later, the prison guard Robert Curtis marches down a long hallway inside Attica. He stops at the office of Vincent Mancusi, the superintendent of the entire prison. It's Curtis's job to tell Mancusi about the riot they just averted. And while the superintendent will probably want to crack down on the inmates, Curtis hopes he can convince his boss otherwise. It seems to Curtis that the prisoners have reached some sort of breaking point. Applying more pressure now would certainly be lighting a fuse. Curtis takes a deep breath and knocks on the door.
Yeah?
Sir, it's Lieutenant Curtis. Can I come in?
Yeah, come on in.
Curtis enters the office and finds Superintendent Mancusi sitting at his broad desk, the view overlooking the 4 quadrants of Attica's yard. But Mancusi isn't looking outside. His beady eyes are focused on a stack of documents. All right, Curtis, what do you want? Well, sir, there was an incident in the yard. It was about an hour ago. Anyone dead? No, sir. It was a fight between Senior Lieutenant Maroney and 2 inmates. No one was hurt. And I'm certain it was a misunderstanding, but because of protocol, I wanted to let you know. Mancusi rises from his chair and looks out at the window at the yard where the event took place. It's contained now? It is, sir. All right, good. And I'm assuming the inmates are in lockup? Curtis pauses. No, sir. We let them go. You had 2 inmates in a fight with a guard and you let them go? Yes, sir. I believe solitary would have been a bad idea at this time. A bad idea at this time? You thought it was a good idea to let the bastards fight with a guard with all the other inmates watching and then show everyone they could get away with it? No, sir. Are you out of your mind? Looking down, Curtis takes a breath and composes his thoughts. Superintendent Mancusi, ever since Mr. Oswald declined to visit the prison, I've noticed that the inmates have become extremely agitated. I'm suggesting we let things cool off. That's why you're not in charge. Go get the inmates and put them in solitary for 2 weeks. Sir, I really ask you to reconsider. It's not about the inmates. I'm looking out for the safety of the guards. Curtis, the decision is final. Get those men into solitary by tomorrow morning. Understood? Yes, sir. Understood. Curtis turns to exit Mancusi's office, and as he walks through the empty hallway, he takes several deep breaths, trying to calm himself down. Curtis is an experienced guard and has dealt with convicted felons for years, but in all that time, he's never been as frightened as he is right now. The attitude of the inmate population at Attica has changed. Something is simmering just below the surface. Curtis feels sure a riot could break out at any minute. And if it comes to that, the guards are unprepared. They don't have the equipment or the training to deal with a riot. Curtis only hopes that the prisoners never realize the power they hold. Several hours later, Attica inmate Leroy Dewar lies on his hard mattress, staring up at the ceiling of his cell. The night's gotten late, but Dewar can't fall asleep. He can't stop thinking about earlier today, when he punched a guard and nothing happened. He's never been so lucky in his life. But then as Dewar turns over, he notices a group of flashlight beams piercing the darkness. His door suddenly opens, and 4 guards stream into his cell. One of those guards is Richard Maroney, the man who Dewar punched earlier today. With a hard look on his face, Maroney orders Dewar to rise. Dewar gets out of bed, his knees nearly buckling with fear. Maroney grabs a hold of Dewar and begins tugging him out of his cell. Again, driven by an instinctual, desperate urge to survive, Dewar reaches out, his hands gripping a shelf. The guards continue to yank on him, but Dewar holds with all his strength, the brown tips of his fingers turning white. Dewar yells out in fear as he grapples with Maroney and the other guards. The confrontation gets loud, and other inmates begin to stir. Soon they're yelling at the guards to get out, to leave Dewar alone. But that only seems to make things worse. Maroney punches Dewar in the side, sending him crashing to the ground. And then, in an instant, the other guards swarm him. They grab his arms, his legs. They mutter curses and racial slurs as they drag Dewar out of his cell. As the guards pull Dewar away, the rest of the cell block comes to life. Hundreds of prisoners start screaming and threatening the guards, and for a moment, Dewar's fear is replaced by a feeling of comfort, knowing that he has the support of hundreds of inmates. And although Dewar can't imagine the punishment he's about to receive, he can tell that his mistreatment has pushed the other inmates over the edge. He's not sure what they'll do next, but something tells him that Attica just passed a point of no return. It's the morning of September 9th, 1971, at the Attica Correctional Facility in western New York. In a long hallway inside the prison, Richard X. Clark walks alongside his fellow inmates as they make their way out of the mess hall. Clark nervously adjusts his glasses. He doesn't like what he sees. This whole morning, the other inmates have had a wild look about them. After what happened to Leroy Dewar last night, after he was beaten and hauled away from his cell late at night, the prisoners have looked angrier than they ever have before. And if the prisoners are angry, they may turn to violence. That's the last thing Clark wants any part of. He'll be out of prison in less than a year, having served a 4-year sentence for armed robbery. It didn't matter that he was innocent. His lawyer told him he was going to serve the time either way, so he should at least plead guilty and get a lighter sentence. It was the bitterest of pills to swallow. But in prison, Clark made the most of his time. He joined up with the Black Muslims and eventually became a minister. Now, as one of Attica's religious leaders, he discourages violence. And as he and the other inmates head out toward the yard, he hopes that some fresh air will cool people off. Up ahead, a guard opens the door to an area known as A Tunnel, one of 4 tunnels that lead to the prison yards. The brick passage is cramped and dim, and as the men are ushered in, an inmate taps Clark on the shoulder.
Hey, Richard, they're coming for us. Hope you're ready. What do you mean? The guards are pissed. The way we cursed them out last night after they got Dewar, they got Lamoury too, the white guy. I don't know what he was doing shoving that guard. Anyways, I'm telling you, they're just waiting to get back at us. Well, I don't know, friend. They're probably content with the 2 men who did the violence. So let's just see. Oh man, Richard, I know you heard it too. People saying that they killed both those guys? No, those are rumors. Just have patience. You'll see everything will be okay.
Suddenly, the procession comes to a halt in the middle of the tunnel. Prisoners start murmuring, and Clark peers ahead. It's dark and claustrophobic, so Clark calls out to a guard.
Excuse me, what's going on up there?
Gate's locked. Hold on. We'll get you in the yard in a minute.
But the prisoner behind Clark pushes forward, a crazed look in his eye.
See, man, it's a lie. We're fish in a barrel. They're gonna kill us right here, just like Dewar and Lamoury. I'm getting out of here. We gotta stop him. Now hold on, friends. Well, let's wait.
But before he can say another word, the inmates swarm around 2 prison guards and begin throwing punches. Clark tries to reach one of them, Robert Curtis, who showed leniency during the altercation yesterday, but he can't reach him. The tunnel is packed with bodies, and Clark is knocked back as a prisoner's elbow slams him in the face. It's chaos, a free-for-all. The prisoners are not only fighting with the guards, but some are fighting each other. His heart pounding, Clark presses himself against the wall of the tunnel, trying to stay out of the growing chaos. There's a good chance this brawl could expand beyond the tunnel, and if it does, there's no telling how far the violence might spread. Minutes later, William Quinn runs a sweaty hand through his close-cropped brown hair. Quinn is one of Attica's guards, and he's standing alone in Times Square, the nickname for the cramped office at the center of the prison. From inside Times Square, he can monitor all 4 of Attica's prison yards, A, B, C, and D. He can also monitor the 4 tunnels that connect these yards to the rest of the prison. But right now, everything seems to have gotten out of control. Over in the A tunnel, there's a crowd of prisoners fighting. It looks like a wild melee. Quinn doesn't understand it. There shouldn't be prisoners in the A tunnel. The prison superintendent ordered that inmates in the A block be prevented from having time out in the yard, punishment for how they responded the night before when 2 men were taken from their cells. But with chaos exploding in that tunnel, there's only one explanation about how this happened. It looks like someone didn't get the memo. A breakdown in communication. No one told the guards in the tunnel that the gate was locked. Quinn doesn't know what to do. His co-workers' lives are in danger, but he has been trained for a situation like this. No one has. As he stares helplessly out at the tunnel, behind him a guard bangs on the gate to Times Square. He yells that he's hurt and begs to be let in. Quinn races over, opens the gate, and the guard tumbles through before Quinn slams it shut again. The guard collapses to the ground, blood trickling from his nose, and he warns that the riot in the tunnel is spreading. Prisoners who were out in the yard saw what was happening in the tunnel and forced their way in. One of the guards went down in the fight. He may even be dead. Before Quinn can process this, there's another banging on the gate. He turns and finds a second guard who's begging to be let in. Quinn once again races over and ushers in the guard, who reports that things are growing violent in other yards. Inmates are arming themselves with whatever they can find. It's out of control. Quinn knows there's not much he can do. He has to call for backup. But when he picks up the phone, he doesn't hear anything, not even a dial tone. Maybe other guards are trying to reach the administrators, jamming up the system. Quinn drops the phone, his hands shaking. He tells the other guards that now all they can do is just wait for help to arrive. The men stare at each other, their eyes wide with terror. Quinn knows that they're safe here in Times Square, but they won't be able to hold out forever. Just then, there's a startling crash. Quinn looks up to see the A tunnel gate bursting open as prisoners race forward with a look of murder in their eyes. Quinn looks left and right, his feet frozen in place. And before he can cry out, a prisoner runs toward him holding a metal pipe. The inmate swings, and the pipe comes crashing down onto Quinn's head. Then everything goes black. 2 hours later, Richard X. Clark walks across the large open area known as D Yard. He gazes across the prison yard, amazed by the transformation that's taken hold in such a short time. A group of hostages are huddled against a wall. It's a mix of guards and civilian prison workers, maybe 40 or 50 of them. They look scared and angry, but they appear to be mostly unhurt. Nearby, prisoners roam free, glowing with the look of victory. This yard is now theirs, and they can say whatever they want, do what they please, without fearing reprisal from the guards. Clark shakes his head in disbelief. Everything happens so fast. First, the chaos in A tunnel, and then the uprising spreading like a fire from one cell block to another. The prisoners armed themselves with whatever they could find, pipes, broken furniture, even football gear. Then they battled the guards and each other. But when the dust settled, the inmates stood together as one. Attica was now theirs. It's unthinkable. And now that they're in power, the inmates could force the prison to finally change its ways. But as a religious leader, Clark knows that organization is everything. The inmates have to be disciplined. They need a clear list of demands. They have to be unified. Otherwise, this uprising will turn to anarchy. So Clark calls out to a group of black Muslim inmates, asking them to form a protective circle around the hostages. This is the only bargaining chip the prisoners have, so the hostages have to be shielded from harm. Then Clark approaches a set of tables, where other inmates sit discussing the situation. He's ready to engage his fellow inmates in a spirited conversation about their goals, their strategies, and the fight that lies ahead. Clark smiles with a feeling of deep satisfaction, because while there may be broken glass under his feet and police sirens in the distance, Clark is confident that together, the inmates of Attica will finally be able to bring about change. Next on American Scandal, the standoff intensifies after New York's prison commissioner finally visits Attica. And as the uprising makes headlines across the country, the inmates gain powerful new allies and enemies. From Wondery, this is episode 1 of the Attica Prison Uprising for American Scandal. A quick note about our reenactments. In most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but all our dramatizations are based on historical research. If you'd like to learn more about the Attica Prison Uprising, we recommend the book Blood in the Water by Heather Ann Thompson. American Scandal is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsay Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsay Graham. This episode is written by Hannibal Diaz, edited by Christina Malzberger. Our senior producer is Gabe Ribben. Executive producers are Stephanie Jens, Jenny Lauer-Beckman, and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.